So welcome everyone to the Birchfield Penny Arts Center Book Club. My name is Mary Marino Kozub. I added my middle name because so many of my high school friends are here today, along with some of Molly's high school friends. So it's a really exciting and special night. Our book club has been in existence since about 2011 when a lovely docent whose name was Jane Roubaix thought it would be a good idea to read the books that Charles Birchfield read. And that is how we began. We did read a few other books, and actually it was The Paper Garden. It was one of the first books we picked up. Wow. That was before we started inviting our authors to be here with us to discuss their books. So we invited Molly in person, however, COVID hit, and so we met with her and The Paper Garden on Zoom quite a few years now, it seems like a million years ago. Since we first started, we have welcomed over 100 regional authors. So all of the authors that we now focus on are people that are connected in some way to the region that we all live in and love so much, and Molly being one of them. I'd like to introduce you to Michaela Warros. I was going to say something else, but I've forgotten. Michaela will remind me in a minute. Michaela will be taking care of the technical end of things tonight. She is one of the educators here at the Birchfield Penny Arts Center, and she'll explain a little bit about how that will work.
Yeah, so those of you on Zoom, where hopefully you guys can see my presentation and can hear us. If you have questions for Molly, you can unmute yourself. But if you don't feel comfortable talking, you can say what you want to say in the chat and I can speak on your behalf. And then I am recording this and this will go on our YouTube channel and our website when I'm done editing it. So you guys can watch it later.
Thank you, Michaela. Right now I have the honor of introducing Molly Peacock to all of you. I think a number of you already know her or at least are familiar with her work. Molly is a poet, a biographer, an essayist, and the writer of tales. Molly's multi-genre literary life has taken her from New York to Toronto, from poetry to prose, from word to words and pictures, from a lyrical self-examination to curiosity about the lives of others. She is widely included in books of poetry. I'm not saying that quite well. As well as author of 7 volumes of poetry, including The Analyst Poems and Cornucopia, New and Selected Poems. Molly is also the author of 2 biographies, Flower Diary, which we'll be talking about tonight, Mary Hiester Reid, Paints, Travels, Marries, and Opens the Door, and The Paper Garden. Mrs. Delaney begins her life's work at 72. There's still hope for all of us. As a poetry activist, Molly was the co-founder of Poetry in Motion, a plan to put the works of poets on New York subways, in buses, and now it's all over the country, Molly, is that correct? It is. Yes, and someone just told me today it's so much fun to be on the subway and come across a poem instead of an advertisement. Yes, so, she is also the founder of the Best Canadian Poetry, an anthology that showcases the best Canadian poetry published in one given year. And I had to look that up to see what that was about. So, Molly is a former Leon Levy Fellow for biographers. Her biography of Mrs. Delaney, The Paper Garden, was named a Book of the Year by the Economist, the Globe and Mail, Book List, the London Evening Standard, the Irish Times, and the Sunday Telegraph. A graduate of Kenmore High School, and we have some other graduates of Kenmore High School and some educators from Kenmore High School here with us tonight. Molly now makes her home in downtown Toronto and holds dual citizenship. Molly earned a BA from Harper College of Arts and Sciences, Binghamton University, and her MA from Johns Hopkins University. She was married to Joyce scholar Michael Rodin, a distinguished professor of English at the University of Western Ontario, who died in March 2021. They met when they were both 13 years old, and after 20 years of being apart, they were reunited in 1984 and married in 1992. literacy love story is recounted in both Molly's and in Mike's memoirs, and we will get to that tonight, I'm sure. Please join me in welcoming Molly Peacock back again, this time in person. Thank you for coming, Molly.
So much, Mary. Thank you in advance, Michaela. And thanks to everyone who is here this evening, both online, and I'm not quite sure where I'm looking so that I want to see you all online. Eventually, I can't see your little Zoom squares yet, but I will later on. And I certainly want to turn to everyone here and look out this window in this spectacular building. For those of you online who've never been to the Birchfield Penny Art Center, it is a magical place. And it's a privilege to be here certainly as someone who's born in Buffalo, but also as someone who comes back and revisits the tantalizing work of Charles Birchfield, who has a little bit to do with Mary Hiester Reid, at least in terms of geography. So could we have the first slide, please? This is Mary Hiester Reid in her Paris studio. She's looking very serious. This picture was taken by her husband. Mary Hiester Reid was one of the very first women we have in Western art who made a career as a painter while she was married. Most women gave up their art careers upon marriage. Mary, who was born in 1854 and married in 1883, kept on. And she kept on for a number of interesting reasons. And she had to negotiate a marriage that was an unusual one. And we'll discuss that a little bit in the next slide. But hold on a second, you can see her. She has her French dress on. So she's stylishly dressed for her day. Plus she's got her messy easel and her paintbrushes. Let's see the next slide. This is the first painting I ever encountered by Mary Hiester Reid. And you will notice in that there are many triangulations in it. There are 3 objects. In each of the jugs in the painting, there are 3 roses. The painting, if you look at it horizontally, is divided into 3, or 1/3 and 2/3. If you look at it vertically, it is also divided by its 3 objects. It is a tonalist painting, which means that the artist is painting the tones of emotion, correlating them with the tones of colors. Usually tonalist paintings are very soft. James McNeill Whistler felt that paint should be applied as breath on glass. And that is what you're seeing here in terms of Mary Hiester Reid's brushstrokes. This is a mature painting done in 1913. She would die less than 10 years later. Just take this in for a second. And also note, it's called A Study in Grays. But when you really look at these flowers, there are all kinds of yellows and pinks. The grayness is especially color-infused grayness in this work. Okay, let's look at the next slide. This is an interior of Mary Hiester Reid's house in Wychwood Park, Toronto. And for those of you who follow the arts and crafts style, and there's the student rooms here at the Birchfield Penny Center are modeled on the arts and crafts style. And of course, Roycroft is minutes away from here. And the Reids, Mary and George, were very much involved in arts and crafts, both at the art colony of Onteora in the Catskills and at the similar art colony of Witchwood Park in Toronto. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of her own house, her husband, George Reid, was a painter and an architect. He built this house. He built a couple, several houses with side-by-side studios. So here's a marriage of two painters. George's studio is enormous because he was a muralist. Mary's studio is smaller and by the dining room, but nonetheless, they have a sense in their marriage of painting side by side. Next slide. Just a quick look at Mary Hiester Reid's grandmother. You should know that she was born into a fairly prominent Pennsylvania family of Muhlenbergs and Hiesters. And in that family, they were not particularly, she did not have particular wealth, but she did have social prominence. She was also related to the Climbers and to a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So she had social cachet. Next slide. Here she is. I'm going to leave us on this slide for a minute so that you can let your eyes wander around Alice Barber Stevens' illustration for an article on the art schools of Philadelphia. The most famous one is the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts. And Mary, who was born outside of Philadelphia in Reading, Pennsylvania, her father died when she was only about 5 months old. Her mother had one other child, an older sister. She also had a child who died. Her mother's alone. The Civil War is moving up toward Gettysburg. At this point, Mary's about 8, her sister about 10, and her mother decides to make a radical move to get herself and her 2 girls out of there. She contacts cousins in Wisconsin and moves to the very new town of Madison, Wisconsin. And they take a very slow train from Reading to Madison. And Mary grows up in a household that is governed by a woman. Her mother never remarries, and as a result, she has control of her finances. She's able to buy property there, and she's able to lend money to other people to buy property as a kind of little private bank. This is very, very important because she instills in her daughters her own sense of agency. When she dies, Mary's older sister is on the grand tour of Europe. She gets off the grand tour and goes into a local church in Spain and declares that she would like to become a nun. She follows the religious life, and Mary is back home, and she has to do something with her mother's estate. So she and her relatives settle the estate. At this point, she's about 19, and she goes back to the Philadelphia area to study at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And you can see here that the women's classes, they actually had nude models, which was extremely important and unusual at the time. Next slide. Here again is the women's modeling class, and this would have been about the time that Mary Hiester Reid was there. She started there in between 1881 and 1883, and they had live human models, but They had live horses and cows too. Next slide. This is a painting done by George Reid, who was at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts at the same time. And I'll step back and tell you a little bit both about this model and about George Reid. Very often the models, the female models in the male painting classes wore masks. And here you have a masked model. And also these were women who needed money. And very often they'd had a number of children, as you can see. And I show this just to give you an idea of women and women's bodies at this moment in time. George Reid, let's go to the next slide and see. Okay, here's Mary Hiester Reid is painted by her husband in 1885. And this looks like a very demure painting, but in glove culture in the 19th century, this is a sexy painting. These are sexy yellow gloves. She's, I think, peeling them off, but maybe putting them on. There's a whole sense of glove striptease in the culture at the time, and especially to have those yellow gloves right at her waist, contrasting with the dark background. It is a quietly but intensely suggestive painting. I know that those of us looking at this in 2024 would not necessarily pick that up, but believe me, at the time, you would have picked it up. There's George Reid in a painting by Mary of him, and you can see as a softly sexy, furry guy, and there was clearly a snap between them. George Reid got to Pennsylvania because Thomas Eakins was head of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. You could go right across the street to the Buffalo AKG and see a wonderful Eakins painting called The Musician. And it was this unusual 3 years because Eakins would be asked to leave. He was radical in his teaching approaches. He allowed women there. He was intensely engaged in the painting of the human body, which is one of the reasons why he was asked to leave, since he allowed the women to paint nude models, himself included. So, but it was an electric and exciting atmosphere there. And George Reid grew up on a farm in Canada, almost on an exact parallel of where Mary grew up in Wisconsin. He was talented as a boy, a talented musician. He was a farm boy. His father was very much against him doing any kind of painting at all. He quietly persisted. He was apprenticed to an architect, which he chafed at, but he learned all of these skills. And in the summer, he went around painting people's portraits and painting portraits of their animals to get $500 to finally get to Philadelphia to study painting from a significant painter. And that is where they meet. He's 6 years younger than she is. And they're painting together their studies, and he makes a very matter-of-fact proposal to her. It probably was not lost on him that she also had some means. They get married, go to Europe, and next slide. Paint in Europe until their money runs out, and they come back to the United States, but they don't stay in Philadelphia. They move up to Canada, to Toronto, where they establish a studio, a painting studio. Here is the role of modesty that Mary Hiester Reid had to assume most people of her day referred to her as quiet and modest. She produced almost 400 oil paintings. She was vigorously engaged in her career her whole life, but she was also a promoter of her husband's career. And this mask of modesty was extremely important in her keeping all of that in balance and making sure that her husband had his due, and he was much better known than she was in his day. Next slide. Okay, just a little sidebar. We're going into a little bit of still life history, and here is a whiskey jug. That green jug is a whiskey jug, which would have been in a very gendered society identified with men. And the yellow jug is a milk jug identified with women. And here is this very fertile fecund milk jug, and out of the milk jug is springing all of the daisies, the flowers of the womb, so to speak. Mary Hiester Reid painted tons of flower painting because she was practical and she could sell them, but also she had a special affinity with floral work. Next slide. George Reid, meanwhile, was a history painter. This is one of his paintings called Gossip. That's his sister in the blue in the front, and that is Mary in the back. You saw a photograph of her where she is quite a bit thinner than in this painting. And again, it was George Reid's want, his style to plump up his subjects. And you can see this in lots of work where there's a drawn portrait of the person and the actual oil painting portrait. Just gives them a little juvederm. On to the next painting. This is also a painting by George Reid, Mary's husband. It became famous in Canada. It was used in a political campaign. Mortgaging the homestead was for farmers to lose their farms, was extremely serious. And George's father almost lost their farm. And this made an incredible impression on him. He was insecure all of his life, feeling that he may end up in financial difficulty. And here's Mary as the main model. She is the disgruntled farmer's wife holding a baby and there is the farmer's son with his head in his hands, the farmer signing away the farm, the banker pointing out what line he should be signing on, the farmer's parents worrying about what will happen to them in their old age now that the farm is sold. This painting went viral, so to speak, and Mary's disgusted, disgruntled face was ended up on the pages of all of the newspapers of the day. And she, who had sat for him through many paintings, something happened in their marriage around this time, and she then no longer sat for him. It took her many, many years to return as a subject. So here we are in 1890. Let's find out what's happening in 1891. This picture is from 1904, but this is called the Mary Luncheon. Every woman in this painting or in this photograph is named Mary, and they've all gotten together for lunch at the Art Colony of Onteora, which was started by the great American decor expert and designer, who was an associate of Candace Wheeler, who was an associate of Louis Comfort Tiffany and in business with him in United Artists. And she began this art colony. Mary and George, during the summertime, traveled. They must have known about this place, but I don't know how they knew about it. I looked. I tried to find out, but I can't. I don't know the initial connection. I can only presume that through their own art lives, they heard about this colony and went there. It's near Tannersville in the Catskills, for those of you who know that area. Next. And we're going to spend some time on this painting. This is a painting Mary Hiester Reid painted in 1891. It's one of her most beautiful paintings, and it has recently been acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The director of the American Wing made a special effort to acquire this painting for our country's perhaps the best internationally known museum, because she's looking for women artists to round out the Met's collection. And before she encountered Flower Diary, this book, she had no idea that Mary Hiester Reid existed. So in acquiring this painting, done in 1891, you can see that the motif of three flowers, especially three roses, that is so distinctive in Mary Hiester Reid's work, begins here with a Chinese ginger jar, and on the ginger jar is a little Chinese sailboat, what would be called a junk, Junque, and this is a traveling boat, a scene of travel. George and Mary traveled to Europe 5 times, which was quite unusual, but they had a lust to see real paintings by other people, and they couldn't just flip open a book and find them. They had to go see the real thing. But also you'll notice in this ginger jar that there are 3 roses. There, again, I tried to find out exactly what kind of roses, and I think they are mermet roses. This is just at the time in the 19th century where roses are being hybridized. And so horticulture is developing along with this type of painting being developed. And you can see how luscious they are, and also how droopy they are. And these flowers are luscious and droopy at the same time. This is a painting that is full of emotion. She painted emotionally. It's a painting I feel that you can read into. They're art historians, and I'm not an art historian. I am a poet with a deep interest in art, and but my art historian friends, colleagues, and revered idols speak about women's still life painting as a form of self-portraiture. And you can think of Mary Hiester Reid's flower paintings as her flower diary. At this time, a younger painter will come into their lives, 25 years younger than Mary. She has often painted has triangularized the subjects of her paintings. There were 3 people in her family, the 2 girls and their mother. There are lots of reasons for 3s, but here there are 2 roses in relationship to one another, 1 rose turning away. I won't go beyond that, except to invite you to feel your way through this painting. And let's look at the next slide. just to look at this detail. We know it's a ginger jar because that jar was meant to have a lid on it, and the pottery has been left raw around the rim in order to meet that lid. And you can just see a little bit more of the brush strokes, but again, like breath on glass. And take a look at the next one. Here's the rose that turns away. And again, you can see here you're looking at the canvas. This is magnified so that you can see the canvas itself and those very, very gentle, subtle brush strokes that give the almost the iridescence of the petals of the flower. Next slide. Okay, around the same time that Mary is born, Viennese philosophers are trying to get at the whole idea of what projection means. And in the Vienna school, a philosopher named Alois Riegel started with the idea of beholding, looking at things. What does it mean to look at something and feel that thing enter you emotionally? So what does it mean to behold? To hold with the eye as well as the mind. So Riegel is making this psychological connection, and he's going to develop an aesthetic theory that is deriving from looking at paintings. So it's art that is inspiring these philosophical thinkers. And it is the kind of emotional art that Mary is creating. So the whole idea of sympathy, which I think is a way of talking about emotional identification, comes into prominence during Mary Hiester Reid's artistic career. And we'll take a look at the next slide. Well, just continuing on here with another philosopher, Vischer. As you see, I've jumped from slide 1 to slide 5. There are a couple in there I've just decided to get rid of. So this idea of elucidating these theories, they needed a word for it. What does it mean to feel into something? Well, the German word is einfühlen. And the idea of feeling your way into something later becomes translated as sympathy, and then much later, well into the 20th century, becomes our word empathy. Empathy is a very modern word. Okay, my sidebar is over, and we're going to get Mary to Paris. And the couple sells up all of their paintings to get to Paris. Here's the Paris studio. And Mary did paint interiors, and there's often a single chair. I think a kind of substitute for the artist herself. It's not a chair in which anyone is sitting. Here it is positioned, looking at the day bed. And next door, they went from art colony to art colony and had a studio in a Paris art colony. And their next door neighbor was Eugene Glacé. And you'll see, you recognize this image from his calendar, and you can buy these calendars today. This imagery is all over the place. And she began to attach to this idea of flattened imagery that was inspired by the Japanese prints that were just coming into Paris at the time. And next, okay, this is a Japanese bowl, an imari bowl. And she was very heavily influenced by the Spanish painter Velázquez. And as a matter of fact, she would write a travelogue of their tour of Spain because she got herself a job. And this is, again, extremely unusual. She became a cultural reporter for a magazine in Canada called Massey's Magazine. And you can see the vigor of these chrysanthemums. And it's almost got wind going through them. They themselves are traveling out of this bowl. And how they were affixed in there, I am not certain. Real chrysanthemums, I don't think would be so well behaved as to stay in this marred bowl, but we're just gonna have to take Mary's word for it. Next slide. And here is a painting done in 1894. I'm pleased to say that I tracked Mary's life through a biography of her husband, and also tracked the younger painter, Mary Evelyn Rynch. And in 1894, Mary Evelyn Rynch became their student. And they also took her to the Onteora Art Colony with them. And they took a number of Canadian students down to the Catskills because they had built a studio for themselves and a kind of dormitory studio for about 10 students. They were living in close proximity, and it becomes clear that George Reid has an attachment to Mary Evelyn Rynch. And this is the painting that was done that summer with a milk jug that would be a standard kind of milk jug that would you could buy in that area. And the roses flopping over, again, the 3 roses, 1 to the side, 2 in relation. Yes, it's mine. It's mine. I'm happy to say. So yes, I'm thrilled to have this painting.
And could we go back to that one?
Yeah, sure.
You described I believe, and this was the painting you
Yeah.
described as those 2 petals almost as teardrops.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks, Mary.
My pleasure.
Sometimes when I speak, I forget my details. Well, yes, as I talk about this painting in Flower Diary, you can see that there are 2 petals dropped to the surface of the table below, like tears. This is a very weepy positioning of these flowers. There's the emotional read here, I think, is an instant and spontaneous one. We look at this and we don't feel that this is a happy painting. Even though I'm happy to own it, we don't feel that way. The droop, the dropping of the petals, the sadness, but it's a quiet sadness. It is a contained sadness. Everything that has been written about Mary Hiester Reid in terms of newspaper articles during her lifetime talked about that containment. She was holding it together.
And may I ask a question
Yes,
before I forget
sure.
to ask it? It has to do with the Japanese prince coming
Yes.
across Europe at the time.
Yes.
And we all know that Van Gogh was inspired by the Japanese
Yes.
prince, and Picasso was blah, blah, blah. But I believe you mentioned that some of the Japanese prints were used to wrap up some of
Yes.
those jars.
Yes. Just to backtrack, for the American centennial, so in 1876 in Philadelphia, there's just a tremendous celebration on the part of the United States. They open up the centennial and they invite countries from all over the world to exhibit at the centennial. And for the very first time, Japan exhibits in the United States. Commodore Perry has, to use that racist word, opened up Japan. I mean, that was a common way of describing Commodore Perry's boat sailing into Edo Harbor at the time. And people in the West were just waking up to Asian ideas of art and totally persuaded by them, very, very excited by them. And it was a big deal to acquire the Imari ware and the ginger jars that she had. And these, in Japan began manufacturing ceramics to export because they realized there was just a fabulous market. And in Japan, of course, there were all of these prints, Hiroshiga and Hokusai, and by many, many other Japanese printmakers, and they were plentiful, and they would throw out the ones that weren't good and the ones that weren't successful. And so they would take those extra prints and wrap up the ceramic ware to ship them. And suddenly in England, artists began unwrapping this stuff and looking at the prints, all crumpled up, but amazed by what they saw. Just briefly, the Reids did not have children. There could have been many reasons for this, but this is one of George's favorite models, and he often painted, this modern Madonna and this child. Here is George Reid's watercolor of the very young Mary Evelyn Rich. So she's quite young at the time. She is their student, and you can see, I mean, obviously a teenager. Here is another George Reid painting the year after the three roses that in the milk jug, the Evening Star. I don't know who modeled for this. My sense, he never painted figures that he didn't have a model for, so my sense is there was a model. I'm not leaping to the conclusion that this was Mary Evelyn Rich, but this is the atmosphere in which they were living and painting. And here is a gorgeous a painting by Mary Hiester Reid, which you can travel to Toronto to see at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And that there in the background is a Japanese print that she acquired. And I'm gonna skip some of the stuff about ginger jars, but they're symbols of status and she owned them. At this point, they pack themselves up and go to Spain because she has this job writing about Spain. This is one of the paintings that she did. Spain transforms her. She gets to see her sister, who has become Mother Superior in a Spanish convent. They haven't seen one another in at least 15 years. And the church arranges for her sister to be able to meet her. And after this transformative period, which also gets them away from the entanglements with the younger painter, Mary asserts herself in yet another way. She starts painting landscapes. And here we have those threes again. It's a triptych. And they're stylized landscapes, and that is a Spanish castle in the background. Next slide. Here's George's interpretation of their trip. That's George painting, and there's Mary writing away in the background, writing her article. I think that was a fairly accurate representation of what happened. Next. Mary begins painting landscapes. again, very atmospheric. This is quite a small painting, and I think an exciting one, and you can begin to see a level of abstraction coming into her work. Another, this is a wonderful painting. This is actually a charcoal sketch in preparation for what becomes a wonderful painting. Here's early spring. And again, you get to see that big jack pine. That's an iconic tree to paint in Canada. And the two flowering trees beside it. I mean, the endless sense of here possibly the mother tree, the two dancing daughter trees, however you would like to interpret this, or not interpret it simply as a painting of spring, but these what were objects in still lives now get invested in nature.
Well,
There's a question. Okay, we've got a question. Yes.
what's the significance of, or any, to the fact that she's changing from flowers to trees?
Well, the significance of changing from still life to landscape is she's going outside. And women often were still life painters because they could do it inside. It could be small and contained. They could attend to the duties of the household. If you leave and go outside, you've got to pack up your paints, pack up your easel, dress yourself so that you're not bitten by too many insects, and charge out into the landscape, as men had, of course, been doing for centuries. And the significance of her doing that is, at some point, she simply turned and said, I'm going to own myself in a different way and go out into the landscape. I'm leaving the house and going out and contending with the natural world.
Is that an emotional release from a marriage?
Well, I mean, if you, as a biographer, having tracked what's happening in the marriage and what's happening in their friendships, to me, it seems very obvious that she found an accommodation in this marriage. She didn't leave. Not that women left their marriages, but she had some independent means, so she could have. But instead, she makes an accommodation, but she starts claiming new territory for herself. That's about to claim more than that. I just don't have, I don't have any basis in fact to do more than that, but I think it's very safe to say that. She did tonalist landscapes, and they went to Europe again. Just as they built a new house for them, George built a new house for himself and Mary with those side-by-side studios in Witchwood Park. Almost immediately, they went to Europe again, and because she had another opportunity to see her sister, and also there was a big Belgian exposition, and it was very exciting to be in Europe at the time. And George had a big painting shown in Scotland. So there was lots of reasons for them to go, and they rented, and kind of did a little bit of an Airbnb in England, and this is one of her paintings from that time. And you can again see the level of abstraction in the sky. Just, you know, if you take your hand and sort of block out the lower third of the painting, it is there's a high degree of abstraction, and you could almost imagine that painting on the walls of the Birchfield Penny Art Center. Okay. Here's George's portrait of Mary arranging roses. This is from 1898, a bit earlier, but They were both admirers of Velázquez, and you can see the sort of Spanish, the great Spanish painter from the 17th century, and you can see a little bit of that Velázquez influence in the dark clothes and the flowers coming out prominently, as well as the face. And another portrait that George did of Mrs. Reid. This is one of the few paintings that is in a museum in the United States. So this is in the Reading Museum, probably donated by some of her family.
Is this after she decided to sit for him again?
Yes, I mean, there's something happens again where she starts sitting for these portraits. She never poses for as a character again. So she is herself in these paintings. She's not playing a farm wife. She's not, no more of that. A little slide out of order. So here we have the Onteora ladies again, and that is a portrait of Candace Wheeler, who was a really dynamic businesswoman and entrepreneur of her day. As the relationship of the three painters goes on, the two women, the two Marys, Mary Hiester Reid and Mary Evelyn Rynch, become closer together and even begin showing their artwork together. This becomes a kind of settled Canadian Bloomsbury, I guess you would say. Here is a portrait by the younger woman of the older woman. It's a very loving portrait. I feel that your emotion is going to come through no matter what. And I don't have any sense of reticence, reluctance, competition, whatever, all of the things that you could imagine that would enter into that relationship. I don't sense it here. And this is tiny, it's a miniature, and very, very delicately done. Just a few happy nasturtiums here. Just to show you those happy nasturtiums, she throughout her life, she painted flowers to sell. She sold at about 1/10 of what her husband could get for a painting. But she always was showing, she always was selling work. She had quite a following. She had many friends. She was a social person who quietly had quite a large network. Here's an illustration she did for the Women's Globe in Toronto, and she was a traveler. And there is a woman holding a globe in her hand with a couple of stylized narcissus or daffodils and a couple of stylized Doric columns back there. And this was another way for her to describe, characterize, depict women as they went out into the world. And as she indeed quietly went out into the world. Next, there she is in her, the photograph is dated in the 1910s, so she's maybe 58 or, no, she's in her 50s, no, she's earlier than that, in her 50s, but looking older to us, wearing an arts and crafts crocheted vest, FYI. Just to interpret the fashion part of this. Okay, next. Here is her dining room right off her studio. No to the single chair. There aren't any chairs around the table. She's not feeding people dinner at this table. This is a studio. a studio picture, a meditative picture, a variety of a self-portrait in a house that still exists. I've been in the house. The house has only had two other owners since the Reids lived there. Everyone that was lived in this house has lived there for a long time.
Is this a museum home today? or
No,
not?
it is owned and lived in by, for those of you who know the poet Anne Carson, by Anne Carson's first husband. Just an aside. Here's Mary Rynch grown up, and Mary Rynch was a plein air painter, painted a lot of landscapes. She's in the, the next generation from Mary Hiester Reid. There she is out there being bitten by mosquitoes and painting on plein air. Here is one of Mary Rynch's paintings. Mary Rynch was a spectacular artist, really, really marvelous. And I'm going to ask you to look, can you see the bridge in the painting? Behind the bridge is some splotchy white stuff. If you get closer, you see that that's a house. George Reid built a house for Mary Rynch and her sister across this bridge, which was across a little ravine next door to their house. So you see this, this relationship carrying on. There are no diaries or no letters that explicitly state what this relationship is. There are newspaper announcements that say, Mr. and Mrs. Reid and Miss Rynch attended this function. Mr. and Mrs. Reid and Miss Rynch attended that function. So it was their relationship was commonly accepted, but I think in very much a don't ask, don't tell atmosphere. This is the last oil painting that we have from Mary Hiester Reid in 1918. She's going to die in 1921. And she called it Past and Present Still Life. Here, there are Spanish objects. It's the first time, to my knowledge, that she paints dried flowers. She's been experiencing heart trouble and angina. There are two roses here, not even in a vase, just cut and laid at the table. It is, to me, absolutely a testament to a painter understanding that she's at the end of her life. Here is the last.
Can we go back to that one?
Yes, let's go back.
So is she the dried flowers and
Well,
leaving behind her
I mean,
husband
I think
young
we're
Mary?
open to interpretation here. We're open to interpretation. We definitely, I mean, what is your emotional sense of this painting? This too feels like an ending. And it's called Past and Present Still Life. So we have the past, the dried flowers of the past. As anyone at a certain stage in life, I mean, I can certainly say that for myself, looks at my past happily. A couple of people from my high school class are here, reminding me of the vitality of the past, but one thinks of oneself in that way. And clearly that slightly desiccated quality that is in the dried, and they aren't even really, they're not dried flowers, it's more like dried grasses. I think are simply, it's suggestive of preserved life. Or even afterlife. And the roses
Are the
themselves.
legacy of the work she left behind.
Yes, that could very well be the work that she left behind. And also, this is done just after the First World War. And both of the Reids were involved in raising money for the First World War. selling paintings, auctioning paintings, and she opened her house to shift of women who would come in and sew uniforms and blankets for the war effort in that dining room around that table. And here's the last work we have of hers, and this is done in chalks. This is done in pastel, not something that she usually did, but she could no longer stand to paint. So she was working lying down with colored chalks. And here's an elm tree. And I don't know if this is a fictional landscape or something that she could easily have seen like out the back door of her studio. After she died in 1921, her friends put together the first major show in any Canadian art gallery, a solo show by a woman. And here is one of the photographs of that show. And prominently is that painting, the first one that we showed here tonight, of the roses in called A Study in Grays. And there is this headpiece that was designed by another prominent Canadian artist, J.H. MacDonald, that was done especially for her for this memorial exhibition. Just after this, the group of seven comes to prominence. It's a very masculine tradition. Mary is thought to be, her work is feminized, it's flowers, and it's European. Her style is old-fashioned by this time and by these standards. These young guys come forward, and at a time when Canada is looking for artists to define its culture, the newspapers latch on to the group of seven, and she fades. And it's very hard to track what happens to her reputation in terms of newspapers or other sorts of articles, but people keep her paintings. Her paintings have been hanging on the walls of homes in New England, upstate New York, Pennsylvania, in Ontario, in Quebec, and come to light all the time as previous generations die off and younger generations want to move the artworks. It's certainly possible to acquire them at auction on the art market now. And now museums are on the lookout for them. I have to say, a painting that before this book was published was listed at $2,500 at a Canadian auction, was auctioned after the book and sold for $22,500. So let's hope that continues. And next slide.
I have a question. So
Yes.
Mary Rinch's work is very similar to the group of seven because Tom
Yes.
Thompson and them are very abstract.
Yes, absolutely.
Was her work kind of within that same?
It was within the time period, but I mean, I'm not a biographer of Mary Rinch. I put in as much in the book about her as would relate to the period of time of Mary Hiester Reid's lifetime. But Mary Rinch went on, and I should tell you all that she married George Reid. She became the second Mrs. Reid, that he married her. He didn't wait the full Edwardian year. He 8 months later, they were married, and she gave up painting for printmaking. I mean, she continued on, but she did works on paper. She also was the steward of both of their reputations. She's the one who kept the scrapbooks. She's the one who sort of kept the biographies going. And because she's turned to printmaking, she wasn't like one of the group of seven. And the group of seven, for instance, were attached to the Arts and Letters Club in Toronto. And women didn't become members of the Arts and Letters Club, I think, until the early 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
So that sense of her as part of it, really a vigorous painter, clearly part of a broader tradition of landscape painting in Canada, but not, we wouldn't even call her the eighth, you know?
Well, yeah, but she has the same kind of aesthetic.
Yes, no, absolutely, and a wonderful painter. There are books here for sale today. I'm happy to say, and the last slide. I think we have one last slide, and I'm just a little preview. I have a new book coming out in the fall called The Widow's Crayon Box. Obviously, heavily influenced by my always looking at art, but this is a book of poems. And I should tell you, in Flower Diary, I haven't spoken about him, but I wrote this book as my husband, Michael Groden, my late husband, Michael Groden, was ill and then was dying. And I write that story into the Flower Diary.
Very much so.
As I did with the Paper Garden. Because I'm not an art historian, I feel that it's important for me to establish who I am and what my, literally my angle, my point of view is on these people and their work. And so because I'm writing the book almost in a, well, as a way, as a relief against the caregiving responsibilities, the backdrop of hospitals and difficulties, it felt only appropriate to put in a bit of that 21st century life and our relationship. Because, I mean, Mike was going with me on these trips to Europe to look at these paintings, to do things. He was a scholar who gave me a tremendous amount of help on my development as a biographer. I never would have become a biographer if I hadn't been living with a man who did heavy research, academic research, and watched him do it and thought, oh, well, maybe I could make an attempt. There is a phrase called the independent scholar, after all. So this just sort of winds around, and